Hey guys, hope all of you are doing well. We started this season off with an episode about the coronavirus, and when I recorded that video, I never would have at the time predicted that the coronavirus would accelerate as quickly as it has. And as I mentioned in a few previous episodes during this season, we did the first video this season about the coronavirus, and the following episode after this one will also be about the coronavirus, kind of checking in on what's happened in the last 2 months and what you can do in order to respond to it. When that initial video was filmed, there were no stay-at-home orders. It had only affected 5,000 people, and today we find ourselves in a very different situation. So, the episode after this will be a follow-up on our coronavirus episode that we did at the beginning of the season, but today we're going to be talking about something that actually has to do a lot with the virus, and that is globalization. I actually wrote all of the material for this episode before coronavirus had really become mainstream in media. And so I didn't necessarily plan on drawing that conclusion, but it is a relevant example of how things like that are happening. So today's episode is on globalization. We are on season 3, this is episode 9, and let's start off with a definition of globalization. So globalization is the process by which businesses or other organizations develop international influence or start operating on an international scale. You have to remember that this is very unique to our generation of people, that you can fly across the world from one continent to the next. There was a long time when all of the continents were not connected to each other. There was also a long time where all of humanity was on one continent. So we have to remember the idea that there are people all around the world and that we can communicate with each other seamlessly and also travel to each other relatively quickly. This is a fairly new phenomenon in the history of humanity, and so it's brought about a lot of changes that were unanticipated because it hadn't happened before. The biggest thing I think of with this is air travel. So modern infrastructure in the air travel industry, along with cell phones and computers, have made the distance between humans a lot less than it originally was. And it's also furthered our ability to travel across the world. So when we look at, let's say, fruit, for example, less than a quarter to nearly 1/2 is imported, depending on what type of fruit. And vegetables, from 1/20th to 1/3 is imported. And so this is data from the 1970s to now, after flight was made a lot easier and also shipping was globalized in a way that it did not happen hundreds of years ago. And so a vast majority of the things that are now thought of as relatively normal would have been crazy just a few hundred years ago. It was very difficult to purchase products that were not created in the area that you lived, whereas now we can get avocados from Mexico along with all sorts of different goods from around the world a lot more seamlessly than would have been possible in the past. So the United States, we've got a GDP of about $20 trillion, and exports exceed $3 trillion. So $150 billion in food, $375 billion in the automotive industry, $150 billion in pharmaceuticals. These are massive, massive numbers. Clothing and shoes, $130 billion. Industrial goods, over $500 billion. Consumer goods, $654 billion. And then the highest being capital goods at $678 billion. So these are staggering amounts. These are ridiculous numbers. The billion is a lot. And when you imagine all the different things going back and forth between countries around the world, you begin to conceptualize just how quickly humans are traveling from one country to the next, whether to sell goods or just to enjoy time traveling. And so U.S. imports, they were less than $2 billion in 1921. Something you kind of have to take into consideration is our population has obviously changed a lot in the last 100 years. It was about at 109 million back then. Now we're at 327 million people. And since the early 1920s, $1 in 1920 would now be $14.50. So the value of the dollar has changed substantially. And so what this means is that we were basically importing $87 billion adjusted for inflation and population change. And within 100 years, we have 36 times that now. So our imports are 36 times, adjusted for everything, what they were just 100 years ago. That means for every avocado coming from Mexico, there's now 36 of them. That's astonishing how quickly the world has changed. And so the dawn of globalization it began long before the American Revolution. There were definitely instances of globalization that were occurring long before the 1700s. We look back to the Silk Road, which was a network of trade routes connecting the East to the West, and there was economic, cultural, political, and religious value being transferred from one area to the next. And this occurred from the 2nd to the 18th century, a very long time, all leading up to when the American Revolution started to happen. And so it began during the Han Dynasty, and China was trading silk, obviously, which connected Korea and Japan and the Indian subcontinent and Iran and Europe and the Horn of Africa and Arabia, all these places that were the crux of life during this time. A big part of that was that they were able to trade resources on the Silk Road. So silk was the major commodity, but you also had paper, gunpowder, all sorts of things people were trading back and forth. And this was the first known globalization vehicle for humanity. And now we have stock markets, international trade, things that did not exist during the 2nd century, but this was the start of what would eventually become the massive, massive multi-trillion-dollar industry that is international trade. If you look back even a few thousand years ago, people wouldn't interact from people that lived outside of their towns, let alone buying a product from thousands of miles away. And so geographically, obviously the United States were kind of separated from the vast majority of the population centers of the world. We're 5,900 miles away from Beijing at San Francisco, even further if you live on the East Coast. And so China shipped America $660 billion in exports in 2018. And they ship almost 8 times our total imports from every country around the world just 100 years ago. So if you look at all the different products that we are trading with foreign countries 100 years ago, China alone is supplying 8 times that. So the speed at which globalization is occurring is truly unbelievable. And a really, really good example of the history of global trade and something that influenced a lot of the modern companies today is the Dutch East India Company, also known as VOC for short, and it was founded in 1602 and operated until 1799. So there was a 200-year span. Their headquarters was in Amsterdam and Batavia, which is the capital of the Dutch East Indies. They basically became their own country. And so in today's value, the Dutch East India Company would be worth $8 trillion. Remember, the United States is $20 trillion, so it's astonishing that they're able to create that much value in that much time. So they're basically the first modern massive corporation, accounting for 40% of the US GDP in their total value. And they became their own state, pretty much a country, a corporate state, and the company was nationalized and dissolved. And after 80 years of decline due to extreme socioeconomic political changes in Europe, it eventually was run into the ground and no longer exists. But it does provide an example of how this is the first inclination where people had an idea, well, we can even create our own nation of traders globally, bringing one resource to the other side of the world and selling it to aristocratic people and even everyday people for the less expensive products. And so this is the first inclination where people really decided that it might make sense to trade things back and forth from one place to the next, even on opposite ends of the world. Now, we fast forward to modern day, there are 6.5 trillion texts sent every year, delivering a message to the opposite side of the world potentially if you have a desire to. And this was impossible for most of history. If you think of how long it would take to get a message from one area to the other of the world, you would have to send a messenger on a boat. Now, instantaneously, in a few seconds, you can send a message from one continent to the next. And that just shows the rapid rate that globalization has completely changed what it's like to be a person. And so, even in recent history, it was expensive and would take months to deliver different messages that you have. And so the world reached 4 million people about 12,000 years ago. We got to 1 billion in the year 1800. So 12,000 years ago, there are 4 million people. 200 years ago, we're at 1 billion people, and we're supposed to be at 10 billion people by 2050, only 250 years. So 12,000 years ago, 4 million people, and in the last 250 years, as 2050 being a reference point, 10 billion. That's astonishing. So basically what this means is that right now there are 2,500 people for every person that existed 12,000 years ago. Think about how the geographic makeup, the industrialization of our world will change as a result of that. And so the world is connected now more than it ever has been in the history of humanity. And it's going to make life fundamentally more dynamic. We're going to be able to have conversations with people who are thousands of miles away. We're going to be able to buy products that are only made in one small corner of the world and ship them thousands of miles across the world. And lastly, relating it to what's going on right now geopolitically with the coronavirus, when a disease forms, it has the potential to spread around the world substantially faster than what would have been possible in the past. And I mean, we have the Black Plague, which killed millions and millions of people at a time when Earth did not really have that many people in comparison to now, and that was with the archaic traveling technology of boats. Imagine when someone gets a virus, possibly they're one of the first people to get it, and they fly thousands of miles across the world. As things spread, globalization is going to change the way that viruses spread. It changed the way that everything was traded. It changed the way that people spend their time. And it's important to remember that not that long ago, people lived lives where they're entirely separate from the rest of the world. They just had to account for themselves. So the reality of being a human being is completely changed by the globalization that we've seen over the past couple hundred years and even the past few thousand. So it's very important to consider when you see that made in Italy tag, when you see that made in China tag, just how much history and accumulated human experience goes into making that a reality. Thank you guys for tuning into this episode. We're going to follow this one up next week with an episode as a follow-up to our previous coronavirus episode. And beyond that, if you have anything that you want us to include in our 4th season, which we will be getting into mid-April, feel free to leave a comment, whether it be on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or natively here on YouTube. We would love to hear from you, and we're looking forward to this next season. I think it's going to be super exciting, and we've already started working on it, and there's a lot of really interesting topics there for you guys. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.